Good afternoon. Hope you had a nice lunch. And after this lunch, this is the session you want to be. So call your friends, text them, and ask them to come over here.
Skywriting.
Yes. So this is not a typical workshop. What we want is kind of very open discussion around this particular topic, audit and DevOps and cloud and everything that is going on across the industry. So there are some ground rules before we start. Number one is we kind of don't introduce ourselves. You know who they are. There's no point introducing themselves again. They are on the program.
We're not with any government agencies.
Right. And the same goes with you. We don't want to know who you are, where you come from. It's just the questions and the answers that matter. So when you ask a question, there'll be mics going around. Just raise your hand and the mics will go to you. The first thing you do is ask the question, not introduce yourself or where you are from. So that's kind of the ground rule we established. And we really want to have that rule because we really want an open discussion, because I think this is very critical. And I have been in multiple DevOps conferences and many other kind of conferences, but I think this is the first conference and this is the first time we have auditors talking to us face-to-face, directly taking questions. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. We do have one ground rule that any discussion or perspectives that we share, they're not meant to be authoritative guidance on behalf of Deloitte. It's just us sharing perspectives.
Jane, you want to kind of...
I don't need to be on camera, but I really appreciate this because even the last 5 minutes of the earlier session, that video is so important. I'll be sending that all to my friends. I think the video that comes out of this is probably the most important video that will come out of the entire conference, because we're getting experts to opine, not officially, but through their experience.
Sharing perspective. Lessons learned from the journey.
So thank you. And I'm so glad that they moved the camera, because otherwise I would have to make a disclosure that if you ask a question and then you get up, we could no longer protect your privacy. We'd have to edit you out or whatever. So thank you to the AV crew for moving the camera. Right. Thank you.
To your point, are you going to pass around a microphone, or are you going to repeat the questions?
Pass around the microphone. So,
we got
so if you raise your hand,
there.
The mic will come to you.
Okay. So my thanks to the Deloitte people, my thanks to Topo.
And I think apart from them, only myself is on the camera, and I'll disclose that actually I changed my t-shirt. I had a branded t-shirt, so I went back to my room and changed my t-shirt. And whatever I'm going to say here is just from my own perspective as a DevOps enthusiast.
This is a therapy session now, guys. Therapy.
So, yes, so just to start, as an icebreaker, I pose this question. So we all in this room are kind of developers, engineers. We write code and send it to production. So the basic question is kind of stupid and dumb. If you look at it, why do you need to audit the whole software delivery process? So if you can just briefly say, and then you kind of go along from there.
Right. Well, it's kind of like building a building, right? When you build a building, you can go and inspect it when it's done, but if you don't know the strength of the materials, they don't pass certain standards, the whole building's going to collapse, even if you follow the plans. That's about the material. So when you think about that example and try to correlate it to a healthy software development lifecycle, it's all about the journey, not about necessarily the final product.
Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think Yosef covered it well. What are the steps you're taking along that journey to say that this is now something that I can rely upon to do my work, or other people can rely upon to do their work? It's kind of a step beyond just testing, if you will, and not just the functionality of the product, but even the entire environment in which the product relies upon. You might have a great application that functions exactly like the business wants it to do, but if it's in an insecure environment, that's not a lot of value when the breach occurs.
So I'm a core developer, so I have been writing code for long, and we do have these situations, and I think it happens every time. You get down in a room or with other developers and engineers and architects and other folks, and the business comes in, and things get heated up pretty soon. And then all the developers ask one simple question: what are your requirements? So that I can code. So let me ask you, from audit perspective, what are your requirements?
So there's you could slice this a bunch of different ways. We talked earlier today about standards and about regulation and how those standards and regulations translates into control objectives and control processes that have to be included in your software. And how you solve that for PaaS is subtly different than how you solve it for IaaS, because in a PaaS environment, hopefully a lot of that is being taken up by the SOC report of the specific cloud provider. You don't necessarily have that if you're dealing with an on-prem, type of scenario. So, you could look at requirements in terms of control objectives that need to be met, but generally, auditors are not going to be specific or opinionated in terms of how you do it, so long as throughout the organization, it could be consistent and be solved the same way, because we are looking for that consistency. Now, what John's going to say is, from a speed, performance, and reliability standpoint, he's probably going to care a lot more, and that's an indirect relationship to my controls, because how you do it potentially has an operational direct implication on meeting those objectives over time.
Yeah, thanks, Yosef. And this is an area where Yosef and I make a fairly good pair, because his team leads, kind of our technology controls department for the audit function for Deloitte. And my team and teams I work with are responsible for meeting those requirements. And sometimes we do hit into gray areas where it's a little bit more around what is the spirit of the control objective that we're looking at, whether it be confidentiality, integrity, availability, so on and so forth. We'll have to think about, okay, from a technology perspective, how are we going to meet that control objective? And so sometimes there's latitude in the response, but that also results in sometimes IT professionals saying, no, I want them to tell me what to do. Whereas the control auditors are looking for the overall outcome and a little bit less on the how you get there, but certainly more on the consistency, as Yosef was saying. But that gray area does cause some level of discomfort for IT folks, we understand. But on the other side, if they're being very prescriptive, now the IT folks might feel less empowered in terms of being able to innovate or have certain technology choices there. So it's a bit of a balance, and sometimes it's a joint journey. Going back to our previous presentation, though, having those discussions earlier on in your software development lifecycle is critical to success. Because if those aren't occurring until, say, your last sprint before release, high opportunity for rework, depending upon those objectives.
Right. So you kind of mentioned.
You want us to be real? We could take this to a real scenario.
Yes.
Right. If you take a look at your SOC principles of a SOC report, you have a ton of control objectives within the trust principle of security. Now, encryption is one way to meet certain of the control objectives. As we all know, not all encryption is created equally with the different services that are available through PaaS or IaaS. Now, the control language is not specific in terms of the type of encryption. Encryption at rest, encryption in transit, is there keys, is there not keys, is it a certificate? But it could be that the type of encryption that you have in place may solve other control objectives or operational or regulatory needs. So a healthy dialogue on how to solve something, you could potentially end up with a scenario where the approach that you're taking just to solve encryption could solve a vast multitude of other areas just by talking more.
So you mentioned a word called control objective. Can you explain what that means and who actually writes those controls and where do they come from? Because as I said, from our developers' mindset, it's always who is asking for it and what is it?
So control objectives typically come with a control standard. So the SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 standard, there's different trust principles, and within those trust principles, as promulgated by a regulator, there's the specific control objectives that are meant to be met, similar to NIST or ISO. So there are the high-level objectives, but there's sample control activities that are somewhat responsive, but again, those are just samples, and they need to be tailored based off of fact and circumstance.
So if you have a question, you raise your hand immediately. So he has a question.
Oh, we got questions.
Yes.
Great.
What happened to ladies first?
Thank you. My question is, something we often see inside larger organizations will be that 20% bubble who are doing DevOps, get DevOps, love DevOps, are beginning to succeed beautifully at it. And as it penetrates the rest of the organization and runs into, let's call them more entrenched ways of working, you run into a lot of obstacles. As you start to try to refine those on all kinds of different levels, tooling or process or how we talk to each other, you get told, you can't change that. It's a control point for our audit. I've managed to successfully investigate these a few times and find out that in a couple of cases, they were literally manual stops introduced into the way people work as an attempt to show that something is being judiciously assessed and looked at. Do you have any suggestions from an auditor's perspective about how we might go about internally disassembling these things, assessing whether they're actually mythical, which we want to believe, or if they're valid and maybe we need to find a better way to comply with them?
Right, so that's a great point, and I think it may work in both ways too, right? It may be a DevOps approach, but a control objective may change, and I have to adopt a DevOps approach. So communication is key. Being empowered to speak opinion in a respectful way. So me and John don't always agree on certain things, but we know we have each other's backs, and we could be very passionate about talking about a topic, but we'll come to a resolution. So as long as that you realize that it is a teaming environment and everybody's best interests are at heart, and by the way, from an auditor perspective, the best interests aren't passing the audit, it's complying with the objective. So when you think about, the type of passing grade that you need, auditors, are not necessarily always the bad guys. Auditors can empower an organization at the same time to transform, because everything has to be safe and secure. We have to conform with our regulatory needs. Totally get that, everybody gets that, but you have to think about the spirit, and this is what John was saying. What is the spirit of the control objective? Could it be that there's multiple ways to comply with the spirit? And peeling back that onion and having a dialogue from that lens, I think that you'll have a more healthy outcome.
Just to elaborate a little bit more on what Yosef said there, we see some of this sometimes in our release pipelines, where you'll start off in a development environment there, and we're looking for lots of iteration, true CI/CD. As we start to move up, or closer to release, we'll introduce some additional controls, but those controls aren't intended to be onerous. So for example, if you do a release to production, you might have your IT organization involved in going into your deployment tool, approving the release. You might have your product owner involved doing the deployment of the release, and perhaps your controls team doing the approval of the release. But this is just a notification and a green light, red light type approval, not a let's get a bunch of people in a room, lots of formality, type slow it down approach. That's not what's intended. So what you're bringing up there, it sounds like a lot of kind of muscle memory in an organization of that's how we did things, so that's how we need to continue to do things, but not really assessing new technologies that still achieve the same objective. And I think that's, to your point about really kind of drilling down on those, saying, what is it you need to do? And we'll find out the new how way to do it, taking a DevOps type approach.
And internal audit has to buy into the business strategy, right? The business strategy is not the same old way. The business strategy is to evolve and to transform and to grow. So when you phrase the dialogue in, we're trying to achieve common objectives, hopefully the outcome will be what John is referring to.
One of my sort of favorite characters from the Phoenix projects, Gene, and I apologize I don't remember his name, is the IT security guy who eventually has an epiphany/nervous breakdown when he realizes that a lot of the IT security controls that he held so tightly to were actually not really that important, because there was a lot of compensating sort of downstream controls. Do you find that there are sometimes some people in the IT security world don't have a holistic end-to-end view of all of the controls that are available, and hold too tightly to the control matrix they downloaded from the Cloud Security Alliance? I mean, how do we help them see the big picture sometimes?
In order to implement any control framework, and even do an external audit, you start with understanding the nature of the business or understanding the nature of the transaction or process. Often an auditor could be sort of stuck on the rigidity of being compliance-minded versus being process-minded. So that's where you got to get to the root of any auditor, which is you audit a business process that has controls built into it. And that's a mindset change. People could be stubborn. People may not be, again, auditors tend to be highly conservative people, but we're evolving, we're getting better, we're getting the help that we need to solve our problems. You guys could help with that. But you got to sort of break through that and take the auditor back to their core principles, which is understanding. You can't have a control objectives or an activity unless you understand the process.
I just want to add a little bit more onto that one, as I like the question quite a bit there. When we first started to pivot towards a DevOps culture and adopting the cloud, we kind of went through some of the same experiences that were implied through your question here. And the core security tenets, they tend to transcend whether it be DevOps we're looking at or cloud. The part where I think sometimes it was incumbent upon us is to really partner and educate. And when you did that just-in-time education, that sometimes was a little too late in terms of getting people along the journey, because you might have been correct, but now people emotionally or organizationally have kind of worked themselves up to a certain point where this can't be right. We must do it the way that we've always done it because that's what's worked for us in the past.
Yeah, we personally had this last week where something hit DEFCON 4 and guys, the controls people and the cloud architecture people, we had multiple sessions, change management exercises, but somehow or other, the coders and product architects forgot or force forgot or they were too busy. So now we need to do refreshers. We level set everybody, got to an answer where you're mitigating the risk, still complying with your standards, but coming up with a path of another iteration of code to get things where they need to be before you would actually need to meet the control objective.
So let me kind of poke in a little bit on these two questions. I think they are similar, right? So do you think that in classic organizations, big enterprises, there's a problem of mistranslation of actual requirements and what needs to be done and how it can be done in a modern way, in a better way?
Yes, and yes. Positive intent, our CTO says assume positive intent and have a discussion. And there's a lot of truth to that statement. Everybody has is well-intended, but translation, when you explain something to an auditor, you want to explain the same concept to a CFO or a COO or an IT guy, you got to know how to translate. So you need to have that one person or a group of people that know how to, I don't want to see liaise, but know how to have a meaningful story with the appropriate stakeholder group. So everybody could be level set. So, we'd have this all the time. We tag team enough. We'll change the whole dialogue, bring in an analogy, to bring a story home, to get the point across.
I'm glad to see that you've moved to a more DevOps mindset, let's say, within Deloitte, and I was listening earlier. I deal mostly with external auditors looking at financial regulations, and I've heard what you've said about conversation, getting to the right sort of overall risk view of things. But what I'm interested in knowing about is when you've gone through that conversation and you're at a point where you're going to get a finding, it's either a fail or not a fail. It's sort of binary. I just wonder if you see your industry moving at all to a more sort of learning, failing, and turning that around quickly is okay. Is that happening at all with the Big Four? Because I'm not seeing it on the ground yet at all.
So I'd say when you think about controls, there's a concept of, before you get to a failure, there's an exception. Right? And then once you pull apart the exception and understand the facts surrounding it, Was there a compensating control? Was it picked up by management through self-monitoring? Is there a waterfall approach of multiple exceptions where you have a cascading effect because something was undetected, that multiple controls potentially have exceptions as a result? So those considerations are based off of audit standards. The nature, extent, and severity of that in terms of how that translates into a positive or negative control statement in a public audit report, that depends on a lot of other factors, within the organization, and the nature of the exception and the extent of the failure and how pervasive it is. So there's all these different, criteria that come up. If you miss something that's small and minor, yes, it's an exception, but will it raise to the level of having a negative impact on our Sarbanes-Oxley, external auditor report? Probably not, because there's other factors that come into play. So I would say the best advice with dealing with any type of external auditor versus a systems auditor or a regulatory audit, use the language of not pass or fail. It's about, exception. When you have an exception, then you have to look at the qualitative factors associated with that exception. Upstream, downstream nature, repetitiveness. Was it isolated? Who detected it? Did you know about it? Did the organization have documentation, do an investigation? Was it self-corrected in the future? That's a positive storyline. So those are the types of things organizations really have to think about. And a lot of it is posturing too.
Yeah.
Gene gets tips.
Oh, no. I'm sorry, I didn't go on. No, I'm in line.
Your bakery number 72.
Extending on your topic of translation. So in the reality, often we have the techie guys having their complexity, speaking their language, and having almost no clue about what is needed from our auditor's point of view, and vice versa. Auditors often live in their terminology and expectations, having less understanding of technology. Wouldn't it be worth to have a kind of minimum viable common language which both sides understand?
Great question. So in our world, this was recognized early on, and all of our technologists, coders that are hired, engineers, they are forced to take a day of audit for non-auditors to have vernacular squared away and concepts more fully understood. Coders are developing products for auditors, so it's important that they speak the language of the business. In any IT environment, you're serving a customer. Your customer is the business. So in a prudent IT shop, something that you guys could have a takeaway with, hey, it works in Deloitte. We teach our coders the language of audit just because they're developing products for us. You have to invest in creating that learning to have people speaking the same language in relation to the business. If I go to John or I go to some of our other coders, what is the strategy of the audit business? They know it, up, down, left, and right. They know the entire business strategy, and they could speak to it. So it's about how you really structure your organization. On the flip side, we've sent our auditors that are working on products, the business people that are doing rotations, they take agile training, they take product owner training, and we send them to cloud training, and they all know how to use VSTS in and out. So we try to bridge that gap in both directions to have a meaningful outcome. And that number one, removes the communication deficits that may exist during the software delivery process, and at the same time allows us to do things a lot quicker, because number one, you don't have to, there's no misconfusion, but they actually help each other out, because John could say, hey, from an audit perspective, I think you care about this. On the product side, on the business side, they could say, hey, I know you care about this from a security lens, and this is what I'm thinking of. Am I thinking about it the right way? And that's sort of the environment that we're able to put together.
Your question's apt. This is certainly something that we've kind of grappled with. At this risk of repeating myself, part of it I think was really essential was bringing our internal technology controls team in on the journey very, very early on, because the control objectives that they have, they're intentionally written at a bit of a higher level so that they're not very brittle. And so that as we as technologists iterate, chase after new technologies that suit the business need better, that's not continually breaking and it's not overly prescriptive. So it kind of leaves us some latitude in how we want to achieve it. But to your point, if that dialogue is only occurring very late, it's almost like we're speaking different languages with each other. I completely agree and have been there. And that's gotten better only by partnering much earlier on in the process.
Yeah, and we'll beg for forgiveness. If I miss something and I'm like, oh, crap, I forgot to tell you about a new control standard, or John will say, we're going to have a difficult conversation, or there's a miss. It happens. It's about the importance and sanctity of the relationship where everybody has the best end game in mind to be safe and secure, and just working through it together.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. The first one is, in the morning session, you shared a suggestion about the privacy by design and security by design, something like that. I think that's a practice and suggestion for the engineering team. I'm wondering that from auditing point of view, how do you still do that? For example, in our company, maybe the auditing is linked with each product release. Yeah, but in the DevOps days, maybe it's hard to do it in every release. Do you do it in a fixed time interval or something like that? Yeah. And the second question is, I totally agree with the concept that kind of control team should be engaged early with the team so that they can work earlier and work closely. But does that also mean that we need to invest more resource in the control team? Yeah, is it, or we should train the engineering team to enable them to do that? Yeah, so two questions.
So we could talk about the last question first, because that's near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
So yes, you do need to have a more significant investment in controls, because you're not just testing at the end. It's about agiles having the decision makers in the room at the right time, which means auditing and controls are no longer a compliance exercise. It's direct value to the business. Because it's value to the business, you have a new story to tell to your COO and CFO when you want to hire more people. That's sort of one lens. And DevOps, again, is about organizational and business transformation. So you're not asking for more money for back office IT security. That's not the nature of the dialogue. On the other side, the concept of controls being a capability that even an engineer could take and download configurations that are pre-configured to be responsive to controls, that's where we're actually trying to head now. How do we democratize the controls element through using automation, through using hardened parts of code that gets ingested into the variety of applications to meet needs? I'll give you a great example. We all have tons of applications within the walls of our organizations. I bet that every single application has a unique way to manage access and roles and security matrices, because every application is different. Well, what if there was a service that was a single service within the walls of our institution that's configurable within certain parameters for every single application within our zones? It becomes plug and play. So if we componentize key elements of our code that are more sensitive and attributable to the control matrices that exists, well, it becomes a configuration exercise and not a coding exercise. And you don't need to spend the effort and the investment of ongoing control testing work because you've done it all by design.
I'd like to just maybe add a little bit onto what Yosef said there, and you have two really good, thoughtful questions, so hold us to task answering both. Yep. But to your point, some of the things we've talked about, they will scale naturally to very large organizations, but at the same time, organizations that are smaller in scope might find that to be a heavier lift. And that's, I think, where part of Yosef's response comes in to say, what are the activities that really do require some level of judgment by a person? And what can you automate? And what can you do to bring that kind of discipline from a DevOps perspective to controls testing, to automatically generating that evidence to say, okay, for this server, these are the people that have admin access to it, as well as here's when their credentials were last rotated, and then what was your organizational policy for that, and is that in compliance? Today, for some organizations, that's a manual discussion between a control auditor, between a DevOps person, takes a significant amount of time on both parts. But if we think about this from a DevOps perspective, that's something that's low-hanging fruit, easily automatable, and evidence that can be generated through a portal for folks. So that's something where I think some of the balance can be brought into a DevOps realm as well.
And I think her first question was about the frequency. If we release 10 times a day, do you want to run those controls 10 times a day? Or is there a periodic nature to it?
It depends on the nature of the release. Not every release of code is created equally. What we've done from a risk lens at Deloitte is we've created a category of release types. Every release fits into those release types, depending on the significance and nature of the release. If there's massive wholesale new functionality or replatforming or significant changing of new architecture versus extension of existing architecture, we're going to do more testing on it. If it's somewhere in the middle of the road, it'll vary, and if it's very, very low, then we're not going to do any testing at all.
By the way, I think this is terrific. And one of the things I love about auditors is the specificity and precision about how auditors talk. I'm wondering if you can, you had a line of reasoning about under what conditions is a control deficiency actually really a control deficiency. So can you imagine for a moment I'm a junior auditor, maybe from another firm that's not as highly trained as yours, and I'm auditing your applications, and I come running in and I say, I've got one. I'm a bottom-up auditor, and I found a developer deploying into production, obviously bypassing the segregation of duty control. How would you respond to me and try to assuage my concern? From a senior person to a junior person.
So a good part of you being at the internal client lens is when an external auditor, whether it's a systems auditor or a financial auditor, come in, we're taking a look at the way you've implemented the standards internally. So that responsibility of mapping your processes to the standards and how you consider the impact of a control exception is based off of policy that the standards say that you as the client, as the entity, have to create yourselves internally.
Can you say I? So our policy is...
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is for your application. I'm auditing you.
So if you're auditing me,
yeah.
I should have a deeply defined control exception process that I have to follow, which include quantitative and qualitative evaluation criteria, because I have to come to a conclusion on a severity, at me as part of management of the company. That's my responsibility.
And so to make this concrete, this is this is your expense reporting application, or it's
Yep.
something, right? Just to make this concrete. So kind of how would you rebut or sort of make your case that?
So if I'm the client and whoever's in charge of Sarbanes-Oxley or compliance did not create a detailed program for evaluation of control deficiencies, that in and of itself is a control deficiency. Because built into any control environment is a process to manage exceptions of controls, similar to having a policy to manage policy exceptions. That has to be a written policy in and of itself that gets followed.
Maybe what I'm looking for is for you to be able to say, no, I have one of those, and the way that we reduce the risk of financial fraud or error is not through an SOD control, but it actually comes from a peer review process, and of which we evidence this way, and I can show you all the evidence that control is working.
And that's exactly part of the exception policy, right? Part of the exception policy is our compensating control. That's the first thing that should be in there. Then you consider the nature and extent of the control failure. What happened as a result? How many times did it repeat? What was the remedial activities that were taken? If it was discovered. So all those concepts should be baked into every organization's policies.
And then, sorry, just one last thing, and a valid response is by design, an SOD control is not part of our control design. That objective is being taken care of, different set of controls.
It could be, depending on the nature of the organization and how you've taken the principle of segregation of duties and implemented it within your unique control environment?
I'll interject a quick question. When I say the question is for you, I really mean that the question is to the audit community in general. The product development.
Now I'm nervous. I got to speak for my colleagues everywhere in the world.
So the product development team feels that they have a lot of enemies around. Of course, the ops hates us because we want to deploy and change up, production every now and then. And of course, the security hate us because, and I'm using the word hate in a very, very light sense. They hate us because we don't know anything about security. We just code and let it go and let them figure out.
Do I need to buy you a drink?
After the. So my question is it the same story there that auditors hate us too?
I don't think so. Again, I go back to if you have common interests and all stakeholders within the organization, let's forget external auditors, because external auditors are external auditors. I can't change that no matter how much I invest in managing my client relationship as an external auditor. They will still refer to me as the auditor. That's just a given. However, you could have a good relationship or you could have a troubled relationship. It has to be based on the concept that you have a relationship. But internally within your organization, that has to do with your culture. That has to do with how the CEO and how financial leadership and risk leadership have created a culture to be in alignment with business, objectives. So it's not an auditor concept, but it has to do strictly with culture, and that's where talent can be involved, and you get people together more often so they understand the nature of what everybody does and why things are important. What if you actually had an open dialogue? John calls me up because he heard something from third hand from one of my controls people. He said, "Hey, Yosef, this is what I'm hearing. I don't know, do you really want to do this?" I'm like, no, she got something wrong. Let me go get rid of the noise out of the system. That happens even where we are, but it's about the trust that we have in one another as colleagues.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Yosef.
No, go ahead.
No, there's similar to, say, development and testing organizations, kind of operations and control folks have a bit of an inherent natural tension, but it's supposed to be healthy. But what is your objective as an organization? Is your objective to achieve a new high score in the number of findings? Or is your objective to release code that's of value to the organization and the organization's clients? So to Yosef's point, a good healthy partnership between the controls team and your DevOps team is one involved in the education, bi-directional, because it's not about getting the findings and ultimately holding product back. From a management perspective, that's just a huge amount of frustration. So while there should be a certain amount of natural organizational tension and a bit of professional skepticism on that, they don't intrinsically hate each other. And if they do, that's kind of a broader organizational challenge there. I'd also like to just come back and maybe just touch on Gene's earlier question there, because that's really speaking to the big question around can developers have access to production, right? And as Yosef said, part of that is going to be, and it depends. What is your environment that you're in? What are the regulations that you have? But let's take a reality check here and say, who wrote the code? Regardless if somebody else put it out there, who wrote the code? So it's a lot less about that last step in the journey and a lot more about the steps that led up to that point and what were the controls that you had in place leading up to there. Now, no organization would want someone, regardless of whatever label is tied to their name, to be able to deploy to production without any type of insight that's occurring there, right? If I'm deploying a code release there that changes the authorization module to allow a backdoor in, that's a problem. So what controls did we put in place in the organization way before we got to that final step in our release pipeline to deploy there, so that we have a reasonable degree of assurance that those controls were met along the way? Could an escape occur? Sure. But just solely having a DevOps person, not quote a pure dev person, isn't going to be the only way to solve that.
And adding to that, thank God we have automation, right? Where we could have segregation of duties historically is about people. But it's really about process as much as it is about people. Process can be automated. It can be coded by design. So what if you had segregation of duties in a smaller organization where steps of process have to be met that create and foster a controls environment that almost looks like segregation of duties from a process lens versus a people lens. Again, so that's not always going to work in every organization. If you're a big financial institution, or if you're dealing with an application that has really deep data sensitivities, it's likely not going to fly. But your facts and circumstances, to John's point, will dictate the variability that potentially can be utilized.
So what John just said is kind of music in ears to me. So here's, let me.
He's not John, he didn't say anything.
So what you said is the title or the label doesn't matter. The main purpose of segregation of duties is that one single developer cannot make the change in the code and deploy it to production without any other.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the layers too. Another one will be who has access to the production systems. And again, putting the labels aside, what is the nature of their responsibilities? What rights do they have to be able to access to that data? What compensating controls did you put in place? This morning, you may have heard me touch on one of the slides around confidentiality by design. So we have the basics in there, encryption at rest and encryption in transit, and everyone kind of takes those for granted. But now organizations are moving to the next new frontier, which is encryption in use. So your DBA, your dev team, et cetera, has access to the database server. They can go into Management Studio or their tool of choice and see the raw data that's in there. In some cases, that though might be private health information. Is there any real reason to have that in plain text, short of, say, the performance concerns that we have? Those now can be mitigated. Depending upon the nature of it, it might mandate a higher spec CPU. But now putting that kind of encryption in use is a great story, both from a compliance, privacy, and security perspective, where you're taking some of those sensitive fields and encrypting them in the database. Now, taking that and bringing that back to there is saying, okay, who was that person? What data did they have access to, and what risk does that represent to the organization? It's less about the people and the titles and more about some of those concerns from a controls perspective.
Yeah, but in reality, what happens, and I think most of you will agree, is that all the organizations that I have spoken to, it comes down to who has access to production, who does what based on the title, as opposed to what actually they did.
That is not what the standard says. That is old world.
So we want to capture this statement and publish it.
That is strictly, again, I'm a financial auditor, that's an on-prem way of thinking. And in an on-prem environment, that is a correct answer. When you don't have DevOps operating, that is a correct answer. When you have a very active, mature DevOps mentality and organization, and you're on the cloud, the principles don't change, but how you apply them can have variability now. It's just different.
Now, not to walk all of that back, but I will say though, depending upon your industry, there can be certain external regulators that come in and say, thanks for all that explanation, but these need to be separate teams.
Right. But however,
that can happen.
That's regulatory driven, right? So if you have a regulation that affirmatively states that, the law will always come after technology changes. We know that. If you're in a regulated industry, right, and the laws that regulate your industry from a technology standpoint are that rigid, as an industry base, you escalate to your regulation department to say, hey, our regs don't align with business today. We got to go talk to our regulator, either ask for a no action perspective or a clarification that will potentially eventually lead to a change in how regulations may be written. And that's happened even with the SEC. That does happen. There's no action positions that are taken on a variety of topics. That's where you don't have enough time to change the law just because it takes forever to change laws.
So quick question then, and John, you kept answering my question before I asked it, so I think it's the third time of asking now. For me, when we start to look at spinning up DevOps transformations, we could try that through proof of concept teams or whatever. At what point should we be involving sort of control teams and audit teams, embedding them as part of cross-functional part of that outcome to understand this sort of thing?
Your first or second meeting with the business. We, from day zero, blank whiteboard, we have security in the room, we have cloud architecture in the room, we have, you have your controls in the room. You're not even at sprint zero. You're at, we went out to lunch and had an idea and we think we could get budget for something. How do you think about it conceptually?
And if that hasn't happened, I take it that's bad?
It's not necessarily bad. You asked for ideal. So ideal, yes. Otherwise, it could be painful to level set everybody.
Oh, he's good.
So I work with a lot of operations engineers, and I think the frustration comes with the audit and compliance world is, this is kind of the story, right? There's these original texts out there, right? And they're short, maybe like an inch stack. But then you've got the prophets, the big four in the middle, and they translate that into like a 6-inch stack, right? And then they talk to the people, the internal compliance folks inside my company, and they're told. But then they go to the engineers, right? And engineers are great when they understand the physics of the world around them and an objective. They'll get it done, right? But they feel like they don't, they're told, well, it's not the principles might change or the same, but you can apply it differently here and there, but they don't really get that option. They're basically told what to do. And they can't talk to the prophets because, they might say the wrong thing, right? So they're not allowed to do that. So, what is the industry doing about, direct education, right? About, is there a way to say, hey, look, because a lot of them, you can read, you can go to PCI, DSS and these things, you can read it. And the engineers will be like, but wait a minute, this is what it says, and I think we're doing that. And they're like, whoa, you don't know this. You're just an engineer. I'm compliance, and I talk to the big people, and they tell you this is what has to be. So then they just kind of roll their eyes, throw up their hands, and say, okay, well, fine, we'll do that. So is there anything going on about direct education, or at least getting down to things the gentleman asked earlier about a common language, but at least just saying, hey, look, this is exactly what has to happen. And like a lot of things in the whole sort of DevOps, SRE transformation, kind of cutting out the middleman, so to speak, that pushing control closer to the people who do the work. So is there something out there that's we're just not aware of? Or is there any thoughts about a kind of a direct education, direct dialogues between your organizations, publicly stating this is what we should be doing, giving that to the engineers?
Great question. So as a regulated profession, we have standards that are evolving that talk about the cloud, that talk about information security. So typically in any auditing firm, you have two groups of auditor competencies. There's financial competencies for the financial audit, but also we have internal control specialists from a business process and/or technical systems side. So if you're going through the audit process with your external auditor, maybe you're having a discussion with your financial auditor, and you got to bring some of the technical auditors into the discussion. If your technical auditors don't have a deep understanding of DevOps and/or the cloud, maybe you have to have a discussion of, hey, could you bring us some of your cloud experts, because you're giving the auditor a chance to bring true value to your organization. But you're bringing them into the dialogue to help you communicate better with your auditor at the same time. Most of the mid-sized and large auditing firms, they have that. We all have that capability. So asking the question, seeing if you can get the right individuals in that could understand how to scale the audit based off of a DevOps mentality, it may just really be an ask and how you phrase it, and they could bring in that capability to help you establish the desired results you would like to achieve in your audit process.
Let me put in another one. The gentleman that was asked, I know his name, but I'm not going to say it. The reverse is also true, I think, and I spoke with many other organizations where they say that our internal audits believe that the thing that we are doing, the DevOps thing, they are all good, as you are saying in the morning, much better, consistent, repeatable, and believable, and all that. But what they say is that when they talk to the external auditors, the internal auditors are told that there's a book written by somebody back in the days. Somebody needs to change that book for us to agree upon this common language, common terms, common processes, and all the goodness of DevOps. So the question is, who is going to rewrite that book?
I thought Gene wrote it already. but realistically, right, if you're not having a meeting of the minds, it's a relationship problem versus a regulatory problem. So you have to sit back escalated to the partner in charge of the audit, escalated it to the head of the internal audit department. Even by Deloitte, like we have our own internal auditors, I end up teaching them the cloud. We engage in meaningful dialogue so people could understand how to take audit principles and apply them to the cloud and to DevOps. So it's in your approach of education. So I don't like to get into, no, you're wrong, even if I know that's right. Let me give you another position to think about. What if we looked at it this way? You want to empower people with the knowledge they have to hopefully see things through the same lens that you're seeing it through. It may not work all the time, but if that's the role, and you're going back to the concept of effective communications, then it'll be a lot better. I mean, I live a life of pain. John does live a life of pain. However, we see the business value and the potency and the transformation that's going to happen, and we know we're going to get there, because if any organization, removes from that, they're going to fail. So it's the lifeblood and the and the sustainment of the organization, and quite frankly, your jobs, right? That's all on the line, because somebody's going to disrupt you that gets it faster and quicker. That is the reality of the situation. If Google or Facebook or Microsoft wanted to go into the audit business, they have hundreds and hundreds of data scientists. They have all the brain power in the world to figure out how to automate auditor judgment by only having a few auditors in an organization. Like, somebody could do something.
By looking at the social network postings?
Yeah, exactly. They'll figure out how to do it. So, again, that's just our industry. Every industry is disrupt or be disrupted. That mentality, that is not a technology strategy. That is not a regulatory strategy. That is a business strategy, and it's back to the business basics of what an organization is driving towards, and all the trickles and tentacles of that organization has to be aligned. If they're not aligned, they're just centered on, we have to protect the organization. Yes, you have to protect the organization, but there's nothing to protect if you're bankrupt. End of story.
Just to build on the question from the distinguished gentleman who will remain unnamed behind me, we're starting to see the evolution of policy as code. So Azure policy, AWS organizations, or closed loop remediation with tools like Puppet. Do you think that there needs to be a domain-specific language, meta-language invented for audit, and how do you see the policy as code evolution moving forward, and are you embracing it? Because if you can define the policy as code, all of that translation error that we've just been talking about goes away.
Well, John's going to give you a technical answer, but I'm going to bring a parallel in for folks to consider before he gives you his technical response. We tried this in the US, and we have XBRL. So we've tried to have common language of financial reporting based off of, XBRL. Yes, it's mandated. Everybody has to file. But
what is XBRL?
XBRL. You should be telling me that. It's an XML-based standardized way with taxonomies of filing financial information. So it's used. So it's used in the U.S. for all public filers to the SEC. Around the world, depending on your regulator, it's used in a variety of similar capacities. So, again, started when auditors and engineers got together, and there's consortiums. If you're not familiar with XBRL, I think you could read the history on it, and you'd find it sort of inspirational. But the concept was a common language to have comparative financial information between industry, between similar clients. So we've tried to do it. It's a lot of time and efforts and energy, and it's over a decade, into this. But I know John has specific thoughts on this topic.
Sure. Yeah. And your question is music to my ears, because it really gets to one of the initiatives that we're working on back home, which is some of these automation activities around our internal technology controls efforts here. Getting to a DSL, I like that. I think that's some next level thinking. What we see right now is organizations that have architecture teams. They create these wonderful Word documents that get published, and then they go sit in a Slack room, SharePoint, choose a technology, et cetera, and then people go off and do their own things. And tools like the policy that you mentioned there are some real ways to kind of use a cloud platform to put some true teeth behind that. As well as now, we're looking at using that as part of evidence to our internal controls teams to say, this is 100% sampling size. this is our control objective, this is our policy that either audits that or in some cases may deny that and prevent that deployment from occurring.
Or fix it.
Yeah,
Correct.
fix it for you. Or tools like Puppet Chef, et cetera, that go out there and manage configuration drift for you as well. So we think that's all really very much part of a compelling control story. To the point you brought about getting to a DSL that might be, say, cross-cutting, provider neutral, I think that's the next step down there. But as an industry, I think we're just at kind of the initial cusp of adopting some things like policy that you've mentioned.
I mean, we didn't have Kubernetes 3 years ago, right?
But really, just really glad to hear you're thinking that.
My question's about, I guess, evidence provided during the process of an audit. So typically we are providing process documents, Word documents, diagrams, screenshots, sometimes even emails, and doing demos. So where controls are automated and built into pipelines, etc., how do you expect to see that evidenced as opposed to giving you paper documents and that kind of thing? How does that change that evidence?
Sure. So this is an effort that we're working on today, where we're enabling our controls teams to go into a portal and go in there and say, select a product, maybe select a geography, select a given life cycle, and then pull that information out on demand for a given environment that's out there.
And they do it themselves. It's called read-only access. It's the
That's
best
right.
thing in the world. DevOps doesn't have to do anything other than sign off on the permission to allow them in.
Sure. And so that's a really, really strong way of doing that. Now there's some ancillary artifacts, architecture documents in there where possible, providing them links with the kind of master repositories for them. We'll provide those as well. And then you may get some auditors that may want to do just an additional set of sampling to say, I trust the tool, but I want to do some random sampling that might be on top. That should be the exception now and not the norm. But the norm now tends to be, okay, we're going to take people a lot of time, pull them aside, and collect all that evidence. Really moving to a more DevOps approach towards control automation, evidence gathering is where we want to be.
And that's on the effectiveness part. But testing the design and the implementation, if cloud architecture and the controls group redefine a security policy with hardened configurations, the process of coming up with those configurations and publishing them into the master repository where people go to pull that code, that lifecycle becomes a control in and of itself that would then get tested.
Sure.
Because that's a manual control,
Yeah.
but the automated process is when they pull that and put it into the code.
Yeah, and just one other thing I wanted to ask, if that's all right. What I've seen is we've done some remediation against a finding and submitted that, and the auditor may say, oh, our methodology requires that we see that operating for 60 days before we can validate it, and that kind of seems very much at odds with the fail fast principle. Do you see things like that changing?
Well, for that one, it depends, right? There's a concept of runway of controls. That is a period in which a control is set to operate. The frequency in which a control is set to operate is directly correlated with your situation. So if a control only occurs quarterly, if it's a quarterly access review, and it failed, you really have to wait till the next quarter to revalidate it. There's nothing you could do.
Sorry. If it's something, we've built some validation into the pipeline and actually there's 300 things going through it a day, would you still want to see that 60 days worth of that happen?
Not necessarily.
And
No,
that's where I think there's a bit of a, maybe we need to educate our internal auditors, but at the same time, not everybody in the technology organisation is in DevOps yet. So maybe we are, but some aren't.
Well, so let me let you guys into a secret. When it comes to an automated control, typically we pull a sample of one. If you want to be conservative, maybe you'll pull 2, 3, or 4. But especially a control that transpires multiple times a day, generally a sample of 1. But that does assume that change management controls, which govern your automated controls, has been thoroughly tested, and there's no issues with it. So, again, there's a lot of dependency into that, but in general, the question that you should feel empowered to ask is, hey, this is not a manual control, it's an automated control. Help me understand why that level of a runway is important.
Something else to consider, in that question there too, is especially if there was something and there was a finding, part of the goal of that period of time is saying, can the organization prove that this wasn't just a one-off spot, I've done a hot fix there, and will the organization immediately regress? Or is this now something that is proven to be a sustained control? And if you have that repeatability, if you're showing that, yeah, you know what, I'm doing this not just the one time, but many, many other times, that can be part of a discussion. But if there's not a lot of that repeatability, then the organization doesn't know, and that's where it can be time-based.
It's a great example. If John is responsible for reviewing code deployments, but he happens to be on vacation for a week, and somebody else did it in his place, and there was a breakdown in the review because it's normally John, but the other person has done it before, and may not be as savvy with it. But then John came back and did a re-review of everything because that's just how John is, and he caught it. Something that's self-identified is much more potent and strong because there's a monitoring element there. So it depends on those facts and circumstances.
Let me ask you a kind of futuristic question. In the future, whether it's near or far future, let's say in the perfect world, everything is automated and all that, do you think that has an impact to the workforce in the big audit community?
Just as today, there's not enough people that understand DevOps, there's not enough auditors that understand technology and DevOps as well. So, the more that we can, automate and make audits go quicker, I'm not worried about jobs for auditors. I'm worried about people that truly understand transformational technology and how to secure it, because it's always going to evolve. I mean, for all we know, ethical AI controls could all of a sudden exist in 5 years that we have to now figure out how to test, just like we have to figure out how to test DevOps. So, the future is very bright for controls, but the adaptability is what's going to be very important.
Hi. In Agile, Lean, and other foundational texts that shape what we do around the area of DevOps, and especially in more recent IT revolution type publications, we have a lot of focus on the human aspects of it, the joy of work, having satisfaction, being in a trusted environment, having autonomy. Dr. Christina Maslach spoke twice yesterday about burnout and the diminishment of that human side, which I recognize as the other side of a coin for how companies often approach human risk, assuming that that's present or worrying that that is present. Now, trying to shape that back to something positive, when you audit, are you seeing any interest in looking at those human dimensions about the workplace engagement and things like that, the principles behind that shape, the human side of work?
So you're asking a very good question, specifically here in the UK, because auditors are in the headlines a lot. What's the value of an audit? Are auditors, missing things? So we're thinking about what is the value proposition of an audit that we deliver to our clients from a financial lens. Is there other elements of a client's organization that may be separate and distinct from the audit standards that, as part of our responsibility to the investing public, we should be thinking about and reporting on and adding value on? So that inflection point, for the auditing profession, that's being driven out of the UK, India, and other jurisdictions, from a professional standpoint, we're in your organizations. We understand your business processes. We probably understand really, really well your business strategies. At the same time, what else could we do based off the data that we have to provide more value to your operational ecosystem and also to the investing public from a transparency and reporting standpoint at the same time? So that introspection is taking place right now.
Even on like a micro level, when you mentioned peer reviews, can you assume a peer review is an effective exception mechanism if people can't speak out with trust?
That's an element based off your control environment too. So, people have to feel empowered, right? So some of it is individualistic, some of it is based off of culture, some of it's based off of individual personality. So you can have a variety of, of ways for it. But like, I give everybody a voice on my team to I'm sort of, John knows this, I'm sort of an outspoken type of person. I could come off as opinionated, but at the same time, I like personally to engage in a healthy debate. So one of the goals that I have is to get the quietest person on my team to debate me, because I want them to grow a voice. Because if you're in a risk type of role or a transformation type of role, the concept of agile is everybody has to have a strong voice. And that's not a shot against anybody from a negativity standpoint. That is agile. It's bringing like-minded people together.
But I really like your question there. Say if someone's not empowered to reject a PR because, hey, this person has more seniority than me, that should be something that an auditor would look at to say, well, what is the incidence of PRs actually going through iteration? Or is just everything getting, okay, fine, let's just pull it into master, pull it into master, pull it into master. So I think that's part of the landscape and what's something that a savvy auditor should be looking at, and not just did the PR occur because that's part of your controls framework, but is it actual healthy control?
So that's the last question, and then kind of wrap up after
This one?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I spent a lot of time with a lot of very large organizations, high assurance companies, very complex, highly regulated at various levels of their DevOps maturity. And in my experience, when DevOps is done well in these environments, the auditors come on board and they become some of the biggest change agents, some of our biggest champions. So if there is a lot of synergy between DevOps and control objectives and the spirit of the audit controls, then I'm wondering if the audit community is incorporating these principles, these ideals into their learning and certification programs so that they can hit the ground running or sort of be part of the initial change, be the champions, and have to be less convinced in the process.
So
I'll add one more couple of sentences, and then kind of that will be a final answer.
And I think John and I probably have some parting thoughts.
Yeah.
As you go and fight the fight.
Yeah. So going forward, as Gene has been doing for years, promoting good practices across the enterprise to make it happier, better, sooner, and faster and safer. How can the DevOps community or the developers work with the audit community in a much better way to kind of create that kind of environment, or rather even open discussion and come to the same table and just have it out?
As an auditor, when I go to a client and I do an audit, I do my best to stay ahead of issues, to stay ahead of problems, to clearly communicate with management and my client about findings, because we're not there to get you. We are there to validate what you've done. That is a core principle, of auditing, and we want to have fun at the same time, and we want to add value, and we want you to feel that you're getting a certain amount of value from the services that we are bringing, to the table. At the same time, we at Deloitte, I just said the D word, but at Deloitte and all of our competitors as well, we are educating all of our professionals in the cloud. So if for some reason, you see a communication breakdown or somebody doesn't get it, you have to go to whoever the chief audit executive is or the CFO or whoever's responsible for that relationship. Say, hey, listen, we need some help. We need some additional perspective. Escalate it. You're never alone. You just have to know when to pull the, I need help card.
I liked your question there, and some that I've spoken to earlier on, but Yosef mentioned something that we have for our IT teams about auditing for non-auditors, and by that I mean maybe the work that we do to deliver an audit opinion, but also I think there's an aspect of educating on the technology controls side, the type of steps you take to lead up to, say, a SOC 2 ISO 27001 certification. What's that training that can occur from the technology controls teams to your DevOps teams, as well as what investments can your DevOps organization make in your technology controls team? Say, hey, here's how the watch ticks. And if you see that over here, you should expect that to show up here and here. And if you don't, that's a finding, and that you're kind of partnering with them. But if it's, I've got the secret answer and I'm not going to tell you, that starts to really result in some fairly unhealthy behavior, and people kind of go to opposite sides of the room, and we want to bring them together.
Yeah. With that, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It was awesome. Thank you. And thank you for all the questions.